Hello, my name is Donna Williams and this is a video about dissociation on the autism spectrum. When people think about dissociation, often they'll think about, dissociative disorders like DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder. And a lot of people presume that dissociative identity disorder is a personality disorder. In fact, it's not. It's part of a spectrum of dissociative disorders, and it's an extreme form of post-traumatic stress disorder. So being a person who is diagnosed at age 2 as somebody with autism, so I was diagnosed as psychotic when I was age 2 because in the 1960s autism was childhood psychosis, and simultaneously being a person who came to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and then the extreme of that, dissociative identity disorder. There's been, a lot of people take quite an interest in, does one cancel out the other? And if not, can people with autism experience dissociation? Can people with autism experience post-traumatic stress disorder? And can people with autism experience such a degree of chronic stress and traumatization that they could develop defense mechanisms such as splitting and having different identities that become triggered in different situations? Well, obviously there are some people with autism that doesn't happen to, who are relatively happy, well-adjusted people with no chronic anxiety. There are people with autism who have chronic anxiety from the time they're diagnosed, sometimes at 2 or 3 years old, who anxiety is such a huge feature of their autism that if they didn't have that chronic anxiety, chances are they would be able to dare a lot more development. They wouldn't have selective mutism if they had that. They wouldn't have dependent stuff and learned helplessness if not for some of their anxiety. They may not have developed OCD. They may not have the level of tics that they have. They might not have developed school phobia or a whole lot of complications that can come together with having a chronic anxiety state. So clearly there are some people with autism who, for them, a large part of their fruit salad is chronic anxiety states. But is that enough to make a person dissociate? Or is dissociating something a bit separate to just an anxiety disorder? Well, people dissociate when they're extremely uncomfortable. They can be uncomfortable for a whole range of reasons. And anxiety is one of those reasons. And obviously, I think we've established that for some people with autism, anxiety is a very large part of what makes the other aspects of their autism so extreme. And if they were not so anxious, a lot of their issues would be much easier for them to tackle. Another form of finding life so overwhelming that you would dissociate may be something like having extreme exposure anxiety. Now, exposure anxiety sounds just like anxiety, but it's actually something sort of special. Anxiety is a involuntary self-protection response that becomes quite chronic. You could almost say that exposure anxiety is like a DID, a Dissociative Identity Disorder state in its early form. So exposure anxiety manifests as involuntary avoidance, diversion, and retaliation responses. And what that means is that the person, when you go to get somebody with high exposure anxiety to join you in something, they may involuntarily just tune you out, avoid, be unable to acknowledge the request. If you keep persisting, they may keep diverting, drawing your attention to something completely irrelevant or seeming really, really busy with something that has nothing to do with what you're requesting. If you continue, you may find that they attack themselves or they might attack you. Even if that's something they've really wanted to do, they may say no, 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 all the behaviours that are associated with absolutely no. People with exposure anxiety unfortunately become so patterned into this involuntary self-protection, very hair-triggered state that in a socially invasive world, a world where therapists, parents, teachers appear to be constantly pursuing, invading, force-feeding them with levels of gush and fuss and intimacy and control that they are not able to desensitize from. They build higher and higher sense of phobic invasion. And I've given some examples of the avoidance response. Another one is your diversion responses, which mean the person is constantly drawing attention to other stuff, and the retaliation responses. But these don't just happen when other people are making requests, because eventually the person with exposure anxiety has these in relation to their own behaviours. So they then may want to go and put a jumper on because they're cold, and they'll go into avoidance. They'll want to put a jumper on and they'll go into diversions and do everything else but the jumper. They'll want to put the jumper on, I think some countries call it a pullover or a sweater, and they'll go into a retaliation response where they definitely don't want a jumper. No, they don't want the jumper, and actually they really very much are cold and getting rather fed up with involuntarily saying the opposite, diverting and tuning out what it is they need. And those people with exposure anxiety can have that about toileting, they can have it about eating, they can have it about getting a drink of water, they can have it about leaving a room or staying in a room. So the more they want to stay, the more they can't stay in there. The more they want to leave, the more they're frozen to the spot. And you might think, well, what's that got to do with dissociation? Well, dissociation is about a triggered response in which the person dissociates, cuts off from what they're experiencing. So daydreaming is an example of common day dissociation that all human beings do. If you have exposure anxiety, you may stare as if in a daydream far more regularly than most people, because your avoidance responses are on such a hair trigger mechanism. Depersonalisation, not taking what happens to you personally, viewing it as if you're an outsider, not taking your life personally, having no emotional response to what's going on. And yet this is very similar with exposure anxiety, where the person will divert into a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with what they're actually feeling. With derealisation, that feeling that you're watching your life as if it's a movie. Things feel quite unreal. You're not quite sure, is this a dream? Is this a real life? Well, with exposure anxiety, one of the things that people with it will commonly do is they'll become the family cat. They'll become the family dog. They'll become a character on the TV. This is very similar to the sort of splitting that you see in dissociative identity disorder. So for a person with autism, this starts out as part of how they're able to reduce that level of intense exposure before others, i.e. it wasn't me who got a drink, I as a cat needed it. It wasn't me who got a drink, it was that TV character who went and got it. It wasn't me who went to school, it was the family dog. And if you work as a professional in the autism field, sooner or later you'll come across kids who become a cat, a dog, various animals, TV characters, even become other children who are in their class as a means of handling certain types of things. And then they'll switch back out of that when that extreme exposure anxiety is not so challenging. So there's one relationship between something that very commonly goes on in people with autism, which is exposure anxiety, and probably affects around 30 to 50% of people with autism, and something like dissociative processes that include dissociation, depersonalisation, and derealisation. When children are small, all children dissociate. When you're making children do something that they find uncomfortable or they're unable to do, they will sort of step out of their hands, step out of their body, go floppy, stare. They'll stare into space. They'll play things out in their head. They'll go to a happier space than what's going on. the teacher will say, come on, stop daydreaming, we're doing this. And for a lot of children, that they'll progressively toughen up, handle more and more challenges, and that's part of their normal development. For a lot of kids with autism, they become masters of dissociative processes, so that instead of people saying, come on, snap out of it, you're in a daydream, they say, oh, that one's autistic. And what exactly does that mean? That one's dissociating all the time? Do they actually mean that person finds it so hard to process the visual, verbal and physical information that they dissociate far more quickly and far more often than the children who can process at a normal rate of incoming information? In which case, we're actually saying that autistic kids employ dissociative processes far more commonly, far more often, far more intensively, and throughout a longer period of childhood, if not their life, than non-autistic children. So there's a relationship between autism and dissociation. Now, dissociation is a way of sort of taking the heat off, and a lot of kids with autism will do this particularly with eating. So rather than taking the responsibility of they are the one who is eating the food with the fork, they'll stare into space and the other person will have to essentially feed them, because they are struggling with handling perhaps the invasion of being expected to eat food. Maybe they have the sort of personality that feels social invasion a lot more extremely. It could be that they just feel that their life as a person with significant information processing problems feels so much more out of control for them than it would for a non-autistic child, that what other people see as simple interactions feel absolutely overwhelming, confusing, over-controlling and overwhelmingly invasive to them. And what do we do when we feel extremely invaded, when we feel out of control of our lives, when we feel almost socially raped by our life circumstances, things that we have no communication to argue back, we have no sort of level of equality to stand our ground or explain our situation? What do? We dissociate. So we cut off, we go into our own head, we play out something from some other time and space, a TV show, some facts, something to distract ourselves into, or we'll just stare through a spot on the wall until we feel we're not there. Toileting is another one. The number of children that I've seen as an autism consultant who basically dissociate from their hands and their body as soon as they are put on the toilet, or as soon as there's any expectation that they will do the wiping, etc., etc. And if this goes together with various toilet phobias, like this bladder shyness and bowel shyness, people who just can't connect to their bodies as soon as they feel someone's watching or can hear them, then what you have is a situation of learned helplessness. And it's learned helplessness because the person is chronically dissociating from their body. And there are strategies to stop people from constantly dissociating, but bullet a gate forcing them through the activity, whilst that may progressively teach some people that there was nothing to be afraid of, for other people it'll actually compound the dissociation. So for those people, an indirectly confrontational approach is essential. What you're talking about there is how to get people off guard, how to get people to feel that what you're doing is not a social invasion. And some of the strategies for that are, for example, working off to the side instead of in front of the person, addressing the object and issue that's outside of the person, not addressing them directly, keeping things low-key, keeping things in small doses, leaving the situation as soon as you can so that they have time to relax before this escalates to a point of dissociation. Some of the strategies may also be things like becoming a character yourself, so becoming a TV character, becoming an animal, so that they don't feel they're in the company of someone who is watching, waiting, wanting, fixating on them as a case. And if you think about that sort of pregnant pause sort of state where you know that people are about to sort of jump on your case, and everyone's waiting. It raises that sense of exposure. It raises that feeling of being in the spotlight. So you have to use an approach that is going to reduce that feeling of the spotlight. So do people with autism develop something further, something other than just the daydreaming and switching off and going into their own head of dissociation? Do they develop depersonalisation, where they become quite formal and they avoid intimacy and they deflect closeness and they avoid interpersonal emotions? Well, of course they do, because there is around an 80% overlap between schizoid personality disorder and being on the autism spectrum. So a lot of people with autism are far more likely to develop an anxiety about intimacy and develop a kind of formality and distancing, develop a depersonalization process as part of managing social, emotional reality they're not ready for, they don't feel at ease with. And if you look at Asperger's, the inability to read, say, facial expression, body language and intonation is social emotional agnosia, very common in Asperger's. So why should those people feel really relaxed on a social emotional level? So if they have a tendency towards that formality, which is the extreme, if you like, of the solitary personality trait, which is almost, we're kind of talking about autism. So it's not surprising that these are people who may be much better than many other people at depersonalization. While some people with autism, particularly if they're rather histrionic or narcissistic, are not very depersonalized at all. Everything is all about them. Everything is ultra personal. But there are other people with autism for whom it's very hard for them to take anything personally. And when they meet you, and even if they've known you for years, they may insist on using your whole formal title or using no name at all. They may not answer to their own name. They may not use any kind of name for themselves. They may feel quite anxious personalizing. They may feel comfortable depersonalizing. So one of the other dissociative processes is derealisation. So derealisation is the D, meaning unrealisation. Things feel unreal. Now, how would you know if someone with autism had derealisation? It would be somebody who struggles to stay in what you see, if you like, as reality, normality. Someone who sort of slides off into essentially a kind of a dreamy other world. And we're not just talking about someone who's gone off into their head. It's someone who can't quite hold those boundaries between fantasy and reality, who is tuning into something and quickly trails off into La La Land, who may then be never quite certain, are they really here? Does anything really matter? They may take the kinds of risks that you would think you could only do in a dream. How could they do something like that? That's so surreal, that's so unreal. And yet, if you understand the experience of derealisation, if a person is never quite sure what's real, why shouldn't they do any whim that comes up or occurs to them? What is there to stop them if they feel like they're living in a dream? And derealisation commonly occurs with a couple of personality traits. People may think derealisation has some kind of property of borderline personality disorder, but derealisation is also very, very common in schizotypal personality disorder. And schizotypal personality disorder also has up to an 80% crossover with the autism spectrum. Why? Because schizotypal personality disorder is defined as living in your own world. It's defined as quite a solitary personality trait in which the person fears forced conformity, takes solace in their own non-conformity, and as such they spend such an amount of time basically living in this hyper individuality, if you like, that when they then snap back to reality and realize that they're not like everyone else, they feel like a weirdo, where do they go? They take solace back in their fantasy world again. So not all people with autism are going to fit this, and there's a lot of people with autism who are far more serious and concrete and wouldn't know a fantasy world if they fell on one. But there's other people with autism who are almost like buzz junkies, who are stuck in this almost playground reality where what's expected of you and play, what's serious, what's silly, what is convention and expected, what is all things possible. It becomes this shifting, very fluid movement between one and the other, a sort of slipped gear in the ability to sort of stay in the one world, if you like. So it's very common for people who fit schizotypal personality disorder to experience derealisation. And that's kind of interesting as well, because when you look at post-traumatic stress disorder, there are certain types of memory function that people with post-traumatic stress disorder are more likely to have, or vice versa. People with a certain memory function are more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are people on the autism spectrum who have excellent memories, who are unable to forget. And we often think, oh, what a talent, what an amazing talent. But in fact, the ability to forget is a very valuable thing. It protects us, it keeps us healthy. It allows us to clear the backlog and let more information in. And so if we don't clear that backlog, if we store everything, it actually uses up some of our processing space. It also constantly leaves us in a very triggerable state because we've held on to a whole lot of irrelevant stuff that we should have let go. And post-traumatic stress disorder is about difficulty forgetting. So it's become stuck. The person can't let things go. And so as they go through life and very simple, mundane things happen, what happens to the person with post-traumatic stress disorder is they get triggered and they have essentially a meltdown. So do people on the autism spectrum experience post-traumatic stress disorder? It's obvious that some people with autism are extremely highly emotional and have a very high tendency to meltdowns or tantruming or panic attacks. It's very obvious that some people with autism have the inability to forget and are constantly replaying often traumatizing events that they've experienced. They'll always replay the troubling events that they may have had, in some people with autism. If you tend towards depression, this may be even higher. And depression is, again, something very common in people with autism. There are certain personality traits like avoidant personality disorder, those very shy, routine-oriented people who have a higher tendency to generalized anxiety disorder, school phobias, separation anxiety disorder, selective mutism, things very commonly seen on the autism spectrum. And these people will have a far greater tendency towards depression and anxiety. And if they have that type of memory that can't forget, then you have essentially quite a recipe for people developing post-traumatic stress disorder under the type of conditions that will happen. So what are those conditions? And why would they happen to somebody with autism? Well, number one, people with autism are born into all kinds of families. They might be born into a family that has no domestic violence. They might be born into a family that is rife with domestic violence. They might be born into a family where there's no substance abuse. They might be born into one where there is, and all the unpredictable and often traumatizing behaviors that will come with that. In fact, there are people on the autism spectrum who will then have children who are on the autism spectrum. And some of those adults will have issues like anger management problems, behavior management problems, mood disorders. They may have personality disorders. They may have substance abuse issues. And that doesn't mean that they don't also happen to have some autism spectrum stuff. But I think we used to live in these old days where we imagined there were these wonderful little well-adjusted non-autistic parents who happen to occasionally have an autistic child, and so certainly those parents couldn't ever have the kind of issues that could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder in their child. In fact, there obviously are some parents on and off the spectrum who have those kind of issues and who also have children on the spectrum. Another reason why kids with autism can develop post-traumatic stress disorder is bullying. And 90% of kids on the autism spectrum have experienced persistent bullying. Some of them have experienced it for years, and some have experienced it to the degree they've developed a range of mental health issues: depression, chronic anxiety, agoraphobia, social phobia, extreme poor self-esteem, related self-harm or substance abuse issues. And many of the adults are still trying to deal with or are in therapy for bullying issues that happen to them in school, anywhere from mid-primary school, late primary school, and certainly secondary school. And for some of them in the workplace. So does post-traumatic stress disorder highly overlap with being on the autism spectrum? Yes. Do people with post-traumatic stress disorder experience sudden triggers that set them off into complete panic? Yes. Do people with post-traumatic stress disorder struggle to stay aware that they're in the present rather than be reacting as if they were back in that past situation? Yes. Does that mean all people with autism have post-traumatic stress disorder? No. Does it mean that people with autism may have a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder than the general population? My view is probably. So let's take a look at the more extreme state of post-traumatic stress disorder, such as dissociative identity disorder. So here we're talking about a condition where the source of the trauma was before that person was 3 to 6 years old. Now, a lot of kids with autism will have been looked after fairly well before they were 3 to 6 years old, but not all of them will have. Some of them will have grown up in care homes. Some of them will have been at-risk children born to parents who for whatever reason were unable to cope or manage their own behaviour and were some kind of ongoing danger to the child. If they were born to a parent who had personality disorders, they may, or had substance abuse issues, they may have been abused in a whole range of ways in an ongoing manner. If this happened to somebody who was already quite good at dissociation, who already had a significantly high level of exposure anxiety and chronic avoidance, diversion and retaliation responses, if this happened to somebody who already was very good at losing themselves into being the cat, being the dog, being the TV character, then chances are that that person is going to be more vulnerable to developing something like dissociative identity disorder alongside of what was already their autism. So are there people with dissociative identity disorder who have autism? Yes. I know of at least a dozen people diagnosed on the autism spectrum who are also diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. I know far more on the autism spectrum who are diagnosed with the lesser version of the dissociative disorders, which is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are certainly even far more people with autism, if not a majority of people with autism, who commonly experience a much higher level of dissociation, depersonalisation and derealisation than people in the general population. And that's to be expected where people are experiencing any degree of chronic stress and have a high level of social isolation, where their opportunities in life, their opportunities to get out of their own head and to get over various anxieties is not as many opportunities perhaps as in the non-autistic population. So what is DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, and how would you recognise it in someone with autism? Well, for one thing, having DID doesn't mean that you don't have autism. So you would still be a person who experienced what is identified as your autism, and that may mean you might have meaning deafness, meaning blindness, you might have an associated communication disorder, so you may be quite echolalic, unable to have a significant language processing disorder and use language that is not easily comprehensible to the world around you, and you can still be splitting into a range of different identities that helps you to manage extreme chronic stress. You can be somebody who may have, say, Asperger's, and you might have difficulty reading facial expression, body language, intonation. You might be fairly obsessive compulsive as a personality and fixated on detail and very about control and go to the nth degree in all your interests, which you might commonly see in Asperger's. You might also be quite dyspraxic and have your clumsiness and information processing issues associated with a lack of neurological integration, and that will not stop you from also defensively and involuntarily having this hair trigger response where you compartmentalize different parts of your life and you deal with them as different identities. And that doesn't mean most people on the autism spectrum are going to experience DID. Unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, which can happen far more commonly to people, DID is really reserved for those who've had severe chronic abuse, neglect, trauma before the age of 3 to 6 years old. So if a person with autism was not constantly put through that during the time where they are developing identity, chances are they won't later manifest as having dissociative identity disorder. Another of the reasons why somebody with autism may develop DID maybe something like where they've had intensive therapy, and this may be constant medical intervention. It may be that they've felt constantly assaulted by having to take things that taste disgusting or make them nearly choke. They may hate all the needles. They may hate constantly seeing doctors and feeling abused by constant testing. They may they may remember having been pinned down by therapists. They may remember being locked in their room and having, not being allowed to move from the seat or use the toilet until they'd completed the ABA task to the liking of the therapist. They may remember being constantly filmed in their bedroom 24/7 by a bunch of therapists who they then continually hear talking about them as if they were a case. Now, whilst for a parent, that may mean, hang on a minute, I spent $60,000 buying that stuff each year. For the person who's experiencing it, that doesn't mean they didn't find that as severely chronically traumatizing. So just because something is wonderful to a carer doesn't mean that the child understood it, appreciated it, or experienced it with their soul intact. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens is if somebody's doing that with their child to try to cure their autism, the more that the person continues to dissociate, to experience depersonalisation, derealisation, and splitting, and unable to stay on track, to relax in their body, to connect and identify with their own hands, their own communication, the more the parents stay on the case and keep throwing the same type of potentially traumatizing treatments at a child who's already obviously emotionally not coping. And one of the reasons they do this is because instead of seeing a child who's not coping, they see the autism. Instead of seeing a child who is in a breakdown state, they see low functioning. So I think we have to be very careful about how we hide behind some of the labels and some of the things that we do because we feel that we're helping, and some of the ways in which the services are like a supermarket. And if you have enough money, and you're desperate enough, some families will go in there almost like a glutton and buy everything and throw it at a very young child who emotionally and socially, even sensorily, is not equipped to handle this type of behavior around them for 40 hours a week, day in, day out. So while some personalities can cope with that, others may not. While some may benefit dramatically, others may actually stagnate and not be able to develop under those circumstances. Sometimes what we think is, the food turns out to be the poison. And sometimes what works for one child is actually the very worst thing that you could do with another. So it doesn't mean that therapy was a bad thing. It just meant you needed to read the signs and stop calling it the autism if the person is in a breakdown state and isn't able to cope and is becoming more dissociative, more anxious, developing more disturbing behaviors as a result of the therapy. If so, why are you not winding it back? Who are the gurus in your ears that are making you continue to invest in bombarding a child with more than they can handle? Were the medical interventions necessary? Sometimes yes. Were there ways of doing them less invasively? Perhaps. Were there ways of offsetting the damage of this level of invasion? I mean, for example, where was the silliness? Where was the rough and tumble? Where was the reminder of the person that this was not the only perspective people had? So if a child didn't feel they were also a person and also engaged at some level with things that they enjoyed, if all that was taken away because it was too autistic, and then all they got given was a bunch of tests, injections, and tablets and therapists, then it wouldn't be surprising that any human being would crack under those circumstances. And certainly a child who is under the age of 6, who is not yet fully formed their own identity, it wouldn't be at all surprising if they were to fragment and compartmentalize, so that later on what you saw was extreme swinging from one version of the child to another version of the child, and often equally dysfunctional. You may even see several versions of that same child and think, is this person possessed? They're behaving as if they're possessed. And I've heard as an autism consultant from clients who say it's like they are two children, or it's like there's so different children in that one person. When they come to school, they are like this. When they're at home, they're like that. When they're with this sibling, they behave like this, and then they're completely different in that situation. And whilst that's normal, that's a very normal thing to have different parts of your personality come together under different circumstances. If you have that so extremely that in each place, in certain places, the person is a danger to themselves or a danger to others, then clearly that's the level, the volume level, is indicating there's a significant problem. So there is work that you can do with people who have developed dissociative identity disorder, and you can certainly do that work whether they are functionally verbal or non-verbal. You can do that work whether they have a significant language processing disorder or don't have a significant language processing disorder. You can do that work non-verbally. You can do that work through typing. You can do that work through objects. You can do that work through mind maps. You can do that work through characterizations. You can do that work through an indirectly confrontational approach. But the most important thing is that you really can't do that work whilst you're contributing to the same condition. So if you're already contributing to the person's dissociation, depersonalisation, derealisation, if you're continuing to contribute to the person's post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're continuing to contribute to the person's splitting within dissociative identity disorder, then you clearly can't solve the problem that you're contributing to. And that is really one of the most important things about DID, is you really do have to help the person to get into a different kind of environment, one that is not continuing to feed the problem. With DID, with something like that, it often doesn't show itself in a very comprehensible way until the person is an adult. And yet when you look back, you can still see in early childhood that this was more than one person or more than one identity. Yes, people can appear to have learned to function as different parts of them, and then as an adult that will all break down and get out of control. One of the other examples with DID is people who were not developmentally at the level that they were pushed into, and there are some people on the autism spectrum who have said that they developed a non-autistic self. So they couldn't integrate it with their autistic self. They felt that they had to create an identity that could exist and not be victimized among the non-autistic population. And they may have done this when they first went to primary school. They may have begun doing this in kindergarten. And so whilst we promote integration, social integration, we also need to keep in mind that there may be a level at which people emotionally can or can't cope. It doesn't mean pull them out of those situations, because social integration is really important. What it does mean is balancing things up so that they don't feel impossibly trapped in that situation, and they don't feel that the rest of who they are is completely invalidated. And that doesn't mean take them home and constantly reinforce, you're an autie, you're an autie, you're an autie. No. Reinforce their personhood. Reinforce their freedom to be the individual that they are. That may happen to be an autistic individual, but none of us are labels. We're not a walking autism package. None of us. No matter how much you feel somebody fits the poster child of autism, the fact is, all of us have our own personality. All of us have a right to an integrated identity. I think the other thing to mention about dissociative disorders and the autism spectrum is that although DID was once called multiple personality disorder, it's actually not a personality disorder at all in the DSM-5. So multiple personality disorder is now defunct. It's discredited. There's no such thing as a multiple personality. There are people who have many personality traits, and we all do. And any of those personality traits can become so extreme they get called a personality disorder, like avoidant personality disorder, or schizoid personality disorder, or schizotypal personality disorder, for example. And all of those personality disorders may commonly overlap with dissociative disorders. But that doesn't mean that a dissociative disorder is a personality disorder. So you can have with or without. And have autism too. So I hope that has clarified the quite holistic picture of the interconnectedness between something like autism as an information processing disorder, a collection of sensory perceptual disorders, associated communication disorders, underpinning physical disorders like gut immune metabolic disorders. Some of the fallout of that are various mood, anxiety, compulsive disorders, and how dissociative disorders can be one of the strategies that has got out of hand in certain types of personalities, but also is more likely in people who are dealing with significant information processing issues in a world they find overly invasive, particularly if they have been over-therapized and have taken that perhaps as chronic social invasion. So I think that without sounding like I'm anti-therapy, and I'm not anti-therapy, I think we still need to acknowledge that people's souls are fragile, and we need to not mollycoddle that or overprotect that, because that in itself is a harm of its own. But what we do need to do is to respect that and to keep our eyes open and our hearts open, and don't let your head be filled by a million gurus who convince you to go bullet a gate with a child who's not even their child. Feel the situation and do what feels respectful, and that way you'll probably be able to navigate the dissociative side of autism. If you're looking for more information about the overlap of dissociative disorders and autism, and especially an indirectly confrontational approach, you can have a look at the book Exposure Anxiety, The Invisible Cage, which is potentially where one of the foundations of dissociative states in people on the spectrum. Thanks for listening, and you can visit my website at donnawilliams.net.